suggested Irfan sir refuses.
Friends and comrades, it's a very great honor for me indeed to be the first speaker in the series devoted to the memory of Comrade Yechury. I need not say much about Comrade Yechury's both practical and theoretical contributions to the Indian communist movement. Personally, I always found them accessible, and even when we did not agree on some small matter or another, always accommodating. It's a great loss indeed for the communist movement that he is no longer with us. And it is therefore a matter of both grief for me and also honor that I have been asked to speak at the meeting where we observe the first anniversary of his passing away. Knowing that he was General Secretary of the Communist Party of India, Marxist, that Marxism is a basic ideology which the communist movement follows, I thought I should take a subject which is that of the applicability and indeed the application of Marxist concepts and methods to India. It is true that Indian criticism and opposition to British rule precedes the communist critique of British rule in India, because already from 1880s, Dadabhai Naoroji and his colleagues were sharply criticizing the way India was being exploited by British imperialism. And while today one is devoting oneself to the Marxist critique of British imperialism in India, it is also proper to pay respectful tributes to our own national figures, preeminently Dadabhai Naoroji, R.C. Dutt and Gadgil, but particularly Dadabhai Naoroji and R.C. Dutt, who described in detail how British colonialism was exploiting in India. And while they used polite words, their critiques stand valid today as they were at that time. So when we pay tributes to the earlier scholars, the earlier nationalists, and earlier scholars abroad like Karl Marx himself and Friedrich Engels, we also pay tribute to Dadabhai Naoroji and R.C. Dutt in particular for bringing out how Britain was exploiting India. I am today specially concerned with Karl Marx and the Marxist approach to colonialism in India and its consequences. Karl Marx's criticism of colonialism was, of course, included in Capital, Volume 1, and also in the subsequent two volumes, and also in his articles contributed to the newspapers in America, which have been published several times, both earlier from Moscow and now also from other places. One edition coming from New York in 1991. The communist approach to colonial India precedes the communist movement in India, because this approach was first initiated by Karl Marx in his articles in 1840s onwards, also by Frederick Engels, in which they pointed out how British imperialism was exploiting India. But from 1980s onwards, Indian economists, particularly Dadabhai Nauroji and R.C. Dutt, developed that critique. And although they often used courteous words, their content was singularly effective against British justifications of their rule in India. Therefore, as we celebrate what Karl Marx said against colonialism in India, we should also celebrate what Dadabhai Nauroji and R.C. Dutt in the late 19th century, although it has been said in criticism and denunciation of British rule and economic exploitation of India. I have a feeling, I think, that the tribute owed to them is not effectively or adequately recognized in our universities and educational institutions. And I think, therefore, it is time that we should look at what they found to be wrong and evil in the British exploitation of India. Their publications, both Dada Nauroji and Dutt, begin from 1880s. And they pointed out how India was losing annually a large amount of its income and wealth to Britain, the so-called tribute, the drain of wealth from India. They were therefore the predecessors of communist critics, of Marxist critics of British rule in India. Our own communist movement began really in this century, and in 1920s various communist groups appeared, particularly influenced by the Soviet Revolution of 1917, and created communist groups. Here it is not my intention or time to go into the various stages in which the formation of communist movement took place particularly after 1917, the Soviet Revolution. But it is best to remember that by 1930s, the Communist Party of India, a single Communist Party of India, had practically been formed. It had already resisted British repression, the so-called Meerut conspiracy case of 1920s and others. Of the Meerut conspiracy case, I am sorry if I make a diversion, because of a kind of piece of information which has not been seen in print, because it came from one of the judges. My father, Professor Muhammad Habib, told me that in 1930s he went to see one of the judges, Mr. Ansari, Shah Sulaiman. And Sulaiman complained that he was not being able to sleep. And my father asked him why. He was Vice Chancellor or Chancellor, I forget which, of the Aligarh Muslim University and a judge of the High Court, later on promoted to what was then called Federal Court at Delhi. And he told him that this because of these blessed communists. When the trial took place, I found that they were innocent. And I told the British lawyer that what was he was saying was absurd. This was not physically possible, what he was saying for the communists to do. He was then, Sulaiman said, was called by the English Chief Justice. And he said that, do you know, Sulaiman, your name is being set for the Federal Court, to which he was appointed later. And if you mess up this communist case, you know what would happen. And therefore Sulaiman said that although I modified the punishments, I upheld the punishments, whereas I intended to say that the law does not justify this kind of case. And therefore he said the communists went to prison for a few years more. This was what he told my father, and my father generally communicated to me when he was reminiscing about previous case. And then I found that this was indeed the case, that Shah Sulaiman had modified on appeal the punishments to the communists, but he did not dispense with the punishments, he only reduced them. And in reward, soon after, he was appointed a federal judge at Delhi and also won the vice chancellorship of the Aligarh Muslim University. So, all these things that take place in life have to be considered, and justice certainly was at harm's way when the cases of communists, particularly the so-called Meerut conspiracy case, came before judges. They might reduce the penalty, but they did not expose the fraud. And today, I think whenever we observe or think about the past of the communist movement, let us also think of our predecessors who suffered for us during 20s and 30s and 40s. That is why I am bringing your attention particularly to the so-called mirror trials which took place in 1920s of communist leaders. As far as the communists were concerned, with some leaders of the Congress like Jawaharlal Nehru and others, they were not tolerated by the Congress leadership. Again and again, within the Congress, there were conflicts between socialists, among whom at that time communists were also counted. Our differences with the so-called socialists came later. And sometimes it happened whenever Jawaharlal Nehru and his supporters shifted, that the left even obtained a majority among the Congress delegates, to the constant consternation of Mahatma Gandhi himself. Well, these are things which relate to some other aspect of history into which I am not going, but we should remember that by 1930s the communists were a fairly important component of the Indian National Congress and often in alliance with the socialists. After 1930s, however, there was a singular problem posed by the communal division. I think the time has come when even that particular period, roughly from 1930s to 1947-48, should be freely discussed within the communist movement. Our difficulty, of course, was that the Congress and Muslim League were pulling in different directions. The Congress for immediate freedom, which communists shared naturally, and Muslim League for communal division, which fitted ill with communist ideology. How can communists be divided according to whether they were Hindus and Muslims? But there, our leaders took a decision which had consequences. And frankly, I think that we are now at a reasonable distance from 1930s and 40s. It is the time to take a position on that particular problem. Those of you, and I think there would be many, who have read R.P. Dutt's India Today. And there's a whole chapter on India in India Today, because this was written in 1945 or so, in which R.P. Dutt, the major communist spokesman of the time, both in England and India, laid out a case why India should not be divided on communal lines. It's one of the most effective chapters of his book on India. Either our readers did not read R.P. Dutt carefully enough, or there were other reasons why the Communist Party at that time decided to treat Congress and the League, Muslim League, in the same way. Of course, with the Congress we had differences now on the question of war, where after the German invasion of Russia, our position was that war effort should be supported, whereas the Congress had still a large amount of hesitation on that point. This is not the place to go into a discussion of that, but it is important to realize that after 1941-42, our position with regard to the war was very different from that of the Indian National Congress. And that was one reason for the division. The decisions that we took under that division, in which we equated the Congress with the Muslim League, is, I think, one which all fair historians should now freely discuss. They were not the same. Muslim League was a communal organization. The Congress was not. The Muslim League cooperated with the British. The Congress opposed the British. On what ground could we then say that they were the same? That Muslim communists should go into the Muslim League and the others to the Congress. It is time now, I think, to look into our own shortcomings of the 40s. I believe that this was a wrong decision, that this indeed divided the communist movement on communal grounds. I'm afraid my memory is very bad. I forget names. But in 1960s, a very important politician of Pakistan came to our house. He had been my father's student, and my father had been a supporter of the Congress and the Communist Party, a peculiar position which he held with aplomb, because both the Congress and Communists were at some time, in 40s in particular, at each other's throats. But he, by making donations to them both, he kept them satisfied. Anyway, this chap came in about, I think it's 1960s, I forget his name. He was Secretary Muslim League. And he began to blame the Communist Party for his discomfiture. He said, I was all right. I was like any communist leader you have here. I did not go to mosque for prayers and all that. And yet the Communist Party sent me to the Muslim League. And because as a communist I had learned to work well, they elected me Secretary of the Muslim League in UP. And when the partition came back, I didn't want to go to Pakistan, but the party said that you must organize the party in Pakistan. So I went there, and there's no party in the name West Pakistan he was talking of, and I am totally lost. And for some reason he blamed the present communists, including me and my father was not a communist but a donor to the Communist Party. And he said that because you did not fight against the Muslim League properly, then I have been lost to the communist movement, and I have been lost actually to any serious cause, because I have no interest left in Pakistan. In any case, the communal problem was a particularly difficult one for the Communist Party, but its decision that Muslim communists should go to the Muslim League and Hindu communists to the Congress, I think, was a very bad decision. And I think we should freely discuss these matters of the past, because they have always shadows in the present. We should recognize that to put Congress and Muslim League at one level was not only a mistake but a grievous one. There was a communal party and there is a national party. Congress at least had a socialist program at that time. They called it socialist, we might not call it socialist, but that was for public welfare. Muslim League had no such program. How could you then ask Muslim communists to go to the Muslim League? And therefore, as I was saying, a student of my father's, whose name I have unfortunately forgotten because now I have become very old, and he came to our house in 1960s complaining that the Communist Party was responsible for his discomfiture. He said, I did not want to go to the Muslim League, but Comrade P.C. Joshi called me and said, since you are a Muslim and we have very few Muslims and we want to have a voice in the Muslim League, you should go there. And because Communist Party had trained me well, I soon became Secretary UP Muslim League. And then Pakistan and a High Court, the Supreme Court judge in Pakistan. And he blamed all this for his departure from Marxism. He blamed all this on Comrade P.C. Joshi and his policy of appeasement of the Muslim League. I think it is time, of course, when we are discussing the history of the Communist Party, to freely consider whether this decision of 30s and 40s of equating Congress with the Muslim League and in effect treating Congress as a Hindu organization, because once you say that Muslim communists go to the Muslim League, then you are treating Congress as a Hindu organization. This was an enormous error. I think there should be free consideration of how these things occurred in the history of our party. I think, however, that there are also difficulties for the communist movement which we should recognize, particularly because when Germany attacked Russia, what should have been our attitude? The only socialist country in the world attacked by the leading fascist party of the world, power of the world. Should we then continue to say that the war is an imperialist war? Or should we say that the change of the war, the character has changed from a war between two imperialist powers, Germany and England, it has become a war between two fascist powers like Germany and Japan and the leading workers' republic, Soviet Union, and our neighbor peoples, China. There may be many who might think that the decision our party took was a mistake, but we decided that the war had changed from an imperialist war, it has become a people's war. Once Russia was attacked and Japan intensified its invasion of China. There are many who think that this was a wrong decision, that we therefore put us outside the Indian national movement, because remember, this was the time of the Quit India resolution of 1942. A resolution which even today looks very awkward when you think that Japan was on the Indian frontier. Was it right at that time to say that British should quit India? that there should be immediate movement and agitation for it. If you look at Jawaharlal Nehru's own papers, far from trying to oppose the British government at that time, he was thinking of how the Japanese invasion would be tackled by Indians, how they would fight Japanese soldiers. Japan was the enemy in his mind. But for some reason, when the actual Congress passed the resolution, Nehru also concurred. And I think it is proper for our part today to question the wisdom of the Bombay Resolution of the Congress of 1942, which actually initiated the so-called Quit India movement at a time when the Japanese were on our borders. And you know what was the Indian people's response? The police terror was there. There were demonstrations, but nothing like the demonstrations when earlier Congress movements had taken place. Nothing like those. So although the socialists in particular then began to use bombs and so on, even in the Aligarh railway station, 2 people were killed by a socialist bomb. Not policemen, nothing but ordinary people on the platform. And these things occurred because of the Quit India resolution. I think we were right to say that Quit India resolution was mistimed, that it should not have been raised at that time, that the enemy, Japanese and German fascism, should have been identified as the main enemy, the British to be tackled later. I think this is what we should say today. And this is what the Communist Party then said. And I think we should stand by what the Communist Party's position remained, that the initial task, once Hitler had invaded Soviet Union, was to defeat the fascist powers and then later on to tackle British imperialism. I think one further matter which needs our attention is that Indian freedom movement should not be regarded as purely Indian. That we had friends in Britain. That the British Labour Party had said, even during war, that if it came to power after the war, it would free India. There had been, as you know, British communists who went to prison in India in 1920s and early 1930s. And I was and my wife were present at the funeral of one British MP, whose daughter, to our surprise, didn't know that her father had been in an Indian jail for supporting the Congress movement. When we told her this, she was greatly surprised because, you know, it is one of the customs of the British that they don't boast. So the father had never boasted about his imprisonment in India to his own daughter. When we told her about it, she was very gratified. But by that time, her father had been buried. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the name of the Labour MP. We still remember there was such a time that in his funeral, because he had gone to prison in the Meerut conspiracy case, the British High Commission, because of Mrs. Pandit, I think, sent a very large flag to his funeral, and the flag said, "Gratitude of India." Now, clearly, the Indian national movement had its friends abroad, and today also we should honor them. As I've said, 3 British MPs went to prison in India for their support of the Indian national movement. Today, we are observing the memory of our past deceased comrade. I think that while it is of course proper that all of us have assembled to celebrate and observe his memory, it is also as important that we should also support further the cause for which he had stood, the cause of socialism and people's democracy in India. Before closing, I would say that both socialism and democracy are priceless values, of value. One can't be of value without the other. To think that socialism can be imposed by a dictatorship is, I think, a fallacy. And therefore, in India today, we should not only propagate socialism, but we should also propagate full democracy. Let India have a socialism which its people want, for which we have convinced its people. And today, as we celebrate, as we observe the demise of a very precious comrade of ours, a major leader of our party, let us also consider within ourselves, I would not say take a pledge, but consider within ourselves how we can promote the further improvement of the cause of reason and socialism in this country, and how we can bring about a socialism which is, as far as possible, accepted by the vast majority of fellow citizens. Well, I think I have said what I wish to lay before you. Nothing is novel there, nothing innovative, but I think a reminder of these particular points should also have a place here, and therefore, while ending, I request you to consider, if you have not already considered, the points that I have raised. Thank you.